Why do sensible, intelligent, knowledgeable people often disagree passionately about important matters of the day? For example, why can some environmentalists be absolutely confident that we need nuclear power in order to avoid climate change, whereas other environmentalists are adamant that nuclear power should be shunned as a dangerous technology that's a waste of money? Of course, there is lots that could be going on in such a debate, but why doesn't rational analysis of such a problem lead all serious, clear thinkers inevitably to the same conclusion? In this video, I'm going to introduce a set of ideas that I call Portfolism that try to help us understand this lack of rational convergence in a way that both recognizes the hard limits on rational calculation without slipping into the relativism of postmodernism. And at the end of the video, I will use the debate about nuclear power as an example to illustrate the ideas of Portfolism and explain why I believe that these ideas can help contribute to a culture of healthy public discussion. The cornerstone of the thinking around Portfolism is to adopt a more precise definition of what we mean by the words reason and rationality. I take reason to be our ability to organize and explain our thinking to others. This links the notion of reason and reasoning very much to the behavior of holding calm, non-threatening discussions where you try to persuade others or explain your thinking to others. In contrast, I take rationality to be our ability to support our thinking with calculations, such as by using mathematics or logic or computer programs. I have a video where I explain why I think these slightly novel but precise definitions are very much in line with our day-to-day usage of these words. In that sense, I'm not trying to radically redefine these words, just giving greater clarity to what we already usually mean by them. The next step is to recognize that when we're in the flow of a conversation, we regularly make assessments about whether the person we're talking to is reasoning well or badly. But in doing so, we do not perform some explicit calculation or logical assessment of their arguments. We don't explicitly check the rationality of what they say. Instead, we get an instant sense of whether their argument sounds right or sounds wrong to us. And here I make the analogy with linguistic dialects to develop the notion of a dialect of reason used by a community of thinkers. Arguments within our dialect of reason will just sound well formed to us, and they will meet our expectation of how sensible people explain their reasoning within a particular context. Whereas arguments in a different dialect of reason will grate against our expectations. However, just as we can switch between using different linguistic dialects in different social situations, so we are each individually capable of reasoning within multiple dialects of reason. For example, imagine someone who's a regular churchgoer who is also a legal expert on certain scientific matters. They would use a different dialect of reason when in a church, as opposed to when in a court of law, as opposed to when in a discussion at a scientific conference. Each of these communities of thinkers will expect a slightly different style with which to progress an argument, and the same person with the same set of beliefs will be able to switch between using the different styles and rhythms of reasoning that are going to be most persuasive in each of the different contexts. Some contexts may prefer more rational, calculative styles of reasoning, whereas other contexts may prefer more narrative-driven arguments. When reasoning within a context that values rational, calculative arguments, then we are likely to use one or more rational tools, collections of standard calculations with known ways of preparing the input data and interpreting the output results. For example, there are standard tools for statistical analysis, and many users of these rational tools do not fully understand how the tool works, but they know how to crank the handle. Rational tools are extremely useful at enabling us to confidently extend our thinking beyond what we are capable of doing unaided. In the Portfolism perspective, a line of reasoning is considered to be a rational argument if it is supported by rational calculations of some kind, and I'll depict this here as a blue line of reasoning that contains an arrow of rational calculation. But you can also have lines of reasoning that are not supported by rational calculation, and hence just the blue line. I do not like to call these irrational arguments, as to my ear that incorrectly suggests that they're a bit crazy. They're not. Much of our daily reasoning is not supported by calculations, but these non-rational lines of reasoning can still be very sensible, serious, and persuasive arguments, such as when reasoning by analogy. However, what is fantastic and incredibly persuasive about rational tools and the rational arguments that they support is that it doesn't matter who cranks the handle. It can even be a computer. The result of the calculation will always be the same. And this neutrality in the processing of the rational tools can give rational calculative arguments the veneer of being neutral, objective arguments. However, there are many reasons, including rational reasons, to question the idea that such arguments are neutral. Indeed, rational tools themselves have revealed some hard limits to what they can possibly calculate, and I explore some of these limits in other videos. But more importantly, when we use rational tools, there are always judgments that we are making about which tool to use, which data to collect, how to categorize and label the data, and indeed how to interpret the result that is output by the rational tool. This means that there are always judgments and assumptions baked into any particular use of a rational tool to motivate an argument. In light of these kinds of limits and criticisms of the idea of neutral rationality, some postmodernists argue that we all live in separate social bubbles within which we construct our own perspective on reality, and there is no rational, neutral way to determine whose perspective is right or wrong. But I think this kind of unbounded relativism can be challenged by noting the distinction between onstage versus offstage reasoning. We are all animals embodied in the same world, so if we were standing next to each other having a discussion, there are a number of things that we'll be able to bring physically in front of each other so that we can examine them together. For example, we could bring a particular book on stage and each see with our own eyes the text of the book. Similarly, we can observe simple phenomena together, such as how blue paint mixed with yellow paint makes green paint. And we could also bring basic mathematical questions on stage so that we can go through the steps of the calculation together. By bringing things on stage in this way, there's no longer a credible way in which either of us could dispute what we can both see in front of each other. And so, given our shared evolutionary heritage and embodiment in the same world, this ability to bring things on stage grounds all of our different dialects of reason with some minimal commonality that is enough to challenge the idea of unbounded relativism. And this common grounding gives us reasons to be confident that despite all of our different dialects of reason, we should always be able to start a reasoned dialogue by, if necessary, bringing the discussion right back to what is immediately in front of us in the world we share. However, there are important issues such as climate change that cannot be brought on stage because many key elements of the arguments about climate change involve the work of large groups of scientists working all around the world, sometimes with large and expensive equipment. Such issues therefore have to remain offstage, and we can no longer rely on our shared embodiment to help align our reasoning. Instead, what typically happens here is that our convictions about a given subject will be heavily informed by the received wisdom that we've come to believe through the networks of people whose ideas we trust. So, the ideas I've described so far underpin this sort of hand-shaped diagram that I often use to depict Portfolism. We have a number of dialects of reason that share a common onstage grounding, and yet they each make earnestly reasoned arguments that extend to offstage ideas in a different way, thereby reaching different conclusions that are often incommensurable with the views of the other dialects of reason. Some of these lines of reasoning are rational, calculative arguments, and some are not. And many of the most passionately contested political and economic debates are about issues that have to remain offstage for one reason or another. This means that many of our debates are happening between the tips of the fingers in this diagram, and this is why it's easy to lose sight of the fact that all of our reasoning shares a common grounding, and that everyone is reasoning well with respect to the dialect of reason that they share with their own community of thinkers. And just to note, this pattern is also present within each of our own thinking. But a modernist would look at this diagram of distinct dialects with a common grounding and hope or insist that ultimately it will be possible to combine all of these dialects into one grand rational framework. But many of our most rational domains of reasoning share the Portfolist pattern. A well-known example of this is the way that quantum mechanics and general relativity share a common grounding in the scientific method, but their mathematical models of how the world works are currently incompatible with each other. And yes, many physicists hope that one day these two distinct ways of thinking about the world will be superseded by a single, unified theory. But such hopes are not themselves grounded on rational, calculative reasons to believe it will be possible. Unification is a hope, an aspiration. So the problem with the modernists' perspective is that they are forgetting all of the known limits of rationality. Indeed, as I've briefly shown, it is our rational tools themselves that have revealed some of these limits, and therefore I would argue that while modernism can be a hope, it is not a rationally supported position to hold. And so, in very simple terms, we can use these three diagrams to highlight the difference between Portfolism and these strawman versions of modernism and postmodernism. In other videos, I will explore how Portfolism relates to other philosophical ideas as well. And in a moment, I will try to make all of this a little more concrete by using the ideas of Portfolism to examine the disagreement about nuclear power that I mentioned at the start of the video. But before that, there is one last aspect of Portfolism that is really important to mention. Given that we can't rationally decide which finger of the hand is the correct one, how can we come to a well-reasoned conclusion about a particular issue? Well, the first answer to that is to remember just how important good judgment is to underpin our thinking. Arguably, one of the dreams of modernists was that we could dispense with the need to cultivate a society of people with good judgment, because we could simply rely on rational calculation to give us all of the best answers. Indeed, that is arguably still the dream of some proponents of artificial intelligence. But we now know that rational calculation cannot fulfill this dream. We cannot just sit in a cave with a super-intelligent computer and calculate the answers to everything. We need good judgments to choose which rational tool to use in a given context, which finger of the hand is most relevant to the given topic. So it is essential for our culture to value and foster a society of people with good judgment. And an important part of improving our judgment is to engage with the world and to engage with other people. Not only do we need good judgment to meaningfully use our rational tools, but we also need it to wisely weigh up the pros and cons between the best ideas when they come from different, credible, but rationally incommensurable tips of the fingers. The second answer to how we can confidently reach reasoned conclusions is to learn by analogy from other areas where we have to manage uncertainty and risks. Since there will always be a point at which we have to rely on our judgment when making a decision, this means that there is a real risk that our judgments on a particular subject is going to be poor. And a well-known way of managing risks is to take a portfolio approach. For example, investors try to manage their overall investment risk by having a portfolio of investments that have different risk profiles within the market. Similarly, to reduce our risks of being mistaken in our choices, we should explicitly develop a portfolio of arguments that preferably use different dialects of reason to explore an issue. By taking such a portfolio approach, we reduce the risks that a faulty judgment in one of our arguments is leading us to make a bad choice. For example, imagine we have to choose between A or B. If we can find multiple arguments in multiple dialects of reason that all suggest we should make the same choice A, this can give us greater confidence in that choice. This is especially true if the portfolio of arguments has been developed by a diverse set of people who will all have slightly different biases in their judgments and assumptions. And, to be clear, this is not about saying that the consensus majority view is always the correct view. Again, we need to be using our judgments to weigh up what we see to be the merits of the lines of reasoning from each of the dialects of reason. And I'm also not saying that it will always be possible to make such a portfolio of arguments. All I'm saying is that if it is possible, then there are good reasons why such a collection of arguments will be more persuasive to more people than just having a single argument alone. And hence the name Portfolism. I felt that portfolioism was just too cumbersome. Okay, I've introduced a lot of ideas in this video. Let's use some of them to briefly examine the discussion about nuclear power. And remember, I'm doing this to illustrate the terminology of Portfolism. It is not a deep dive into this specific debate. The first step of any portfolist analysis of a discussion would be to recognize the different dialects of reason involved. And in this simple example, we'll only look at two dialects as used by the pro-nuclear environmentalists and the anti-nuclear environmentalists. And it's worth noting that what I'm calling here two dialects would actually best be categorized as two sub-dialects of the broader environmentalist dialect of reason, which could in turn be seen as a sub-dialect of the broader scientific dialect of reason. And indeed, these two individuals may share many of the same values and attitudes in many other subjects. So the structure and relationships between dialects of reason is more complex than I've been depicting here. But for clarity, we'll go back to using the simpler diagram. And we can see these two communities of thinkers as reasoning within dialects because they're each likely to use standard argument tropes that their side of this debate would see as an obvious winning move, but that the other side would question. For example, we can imagine the pro-nuclear environmentalist saying something like, "But we'll never be able to charge up all of our electric cars just on wind and solar, so we need nuclear power." In contrast, the anti-nuclear person might say, "But more nuclear power plants are just going to create more dangerous radioactive waste, so we must stop building them." And while there may be well-referenced rational calculative arguments used by some members of each community to support these lines of reasoning, there will be many people in each group who know the argument trope without knowing the details of the underlying rational arguments that support these standard moves. And stringing together a series of such tropes will instantly sound like good reasoning to their own community of thinkers, but poor reasoning to the other side. Each view is a learned reasoning dialect from a community as much as a rationally justified perspective on the world. So, how does an actual discussion progress between people using different dialects of reason? Well, we've talked about the onstage versus offstage distinction. And during a conversation between two or more people, they jointly build what could be called the shared stage. This is the set of otherwise offstage ideas and narratives and facts and figures that one or other person wants to bring into the conversation. This doesn't mean that all parties in the conversation agree with the interpretation of these ideas, but to get into any meaningful discussion, they must at least agree to engage at some level with the offstage ideas that are important to each other. So, for this discussion, we can imagine some ideas that each side might want to bring onto the shared stage. The pro-nuclear environmentalist might note that renewable energy can be unreliable, or that we're running out of lithium to build all of the batteries that we need to store the energy, or that there are a new generation of smaller, safer nuclear reactors in development. The anti-nuclear environmentalist might note all of the accidents that nuclear power plants have had, such as Fukushima and Chernobyl. They might also note how expensive and slow it is to build new nuclear power compared to the urgency of climate change. And they might mention the huge costs and risks around storing nuclear waste. So this gives us an idea of what the shared stage might look like for this discussion. And we can now examine how each side of the debate will interpret the ideas that have been brought onto this shared stage. We can imagine the pro-nuclear environmentalist might look at the anti-concerns and say, actually, the deaths and impacts from such nuclear disasters turn out to be much less than feared. And yes, the old generation of reactors are ridiculously expensive, but the new generation will be cheaper and faster to build and run. And we already have the nuclear waste problem, and new nuclear power will bring huge benefits for only a small amount of extra waste. In contrast, the anti-nuclear environmentalist might respond to the pro-ideas by saying, renewables might be intermittent, but as we move to smart grids, we'll be able to smooth out the generation and use of renewable energy. And we may be running out of new lithium, but that's why we need to recycle as much of it as possible, and there are other ways to make batteries and store electricity. And in relation to the new generation of nuclear reactors, yeah, but it's easy to paint a rosy picture of technology that hasn't yet been tried at scale. The key point here is that neither side of the debate needs to completely refute the basic facts that the other side is bringing onto the shared stage in order to maintain their position. Often, it is just the interpretation and importance of each fact that differs between the two people arguing. And so, simply bringing more facts and figures into this situation is unlikely to change the dynamics of the debate. Instead, it can be more useful to examine the deeper concerns driving their judgments. For example, the anti-nuclear environmentalists might be particularly worried about any level of man-made radiation going into the environment. And they may have a deep distrust of all large-scale technology projects. The pro-environmentalist maybe has a deep hope that it will be possible for our societies to remain high-energy societies with lots of rapid mobility and cool gadgets and technology. And they may have a distrust that renewable energy sources alone will be able to support such a society. So they see nuclear power as the only route to the society they hope for. It just must work. In this kind of deeper context, it is no wonder that each side of the debate frames all of the issues around nuclear energy the way that they do. And the real debate that ought to be happening first should be about these deeper concerns and hopes and fears. In the ideal situation, by working together to understand each other's underlying concerns and then progressively working through the elements on the shared stage, a small group of people might be able to synthesize a shared understanding of the issues at hand and develop some shared language for talking about the key points they've agreed upon. So in some sense, they will have now developed the beginnings of a new, shared sub-dialect of reason about the issue. And in the course of their discussion, they could well have developed their own argument tropes that they can use later as shorthand to refer back to aspects of their deeper, longer discussion. But of course, this change in their thinking on this particular topic does not mean that they will now agree on all other areas of reasoning, or that other members of their original communities of thinkers will follow along a similar path. These kinds of changes in our reasoning happen between particular individuals, one discussion, one interaction at a time. There is no shortcut. In the discussion we've been looking at here, both people might now agree on a view that reflects some kind of synthesis of the underlying concerns that they each brought into the discussion. For example, they might now both agree that some new nuclear could go ahead, but only if it uses reprocessed nuclear waste, is small, cheap and fast to build, and is built on existing nuclear power sites, or whatever synthesis now makes sense to them both. Maybe. The point of this example is not to suggest that there is always going to be a path along which any discussion can travel to get to an agreement. No, I've used this example just to show how the ideas of Portfolism can help to reveal the deeper structure in a debate. And I suggested a possible route to agreement at the end, merely to illustrate how Portfolism can also understand how sometimes our views do change and agreement becomes possible. The hand metaphor is meant to imply a snapshot in time of an evolving landscape of dialects of reason, not a permanent, unchanging structure. And indeed, my hope is that by understanding why it is reasonable for us to disagree, it may actually make it easier for us to find a path to agreement. I think a healthy attitude towards public discussion is to assume, at least to begin with, that the person you are talking with would also like this world to be a better place for everyone to live in. They think of themselves as a good person with good intentions behind their perspective on things. Their reasoning might sound poor to you, but that probably means that your reasoning sounds poor to them. You have different interpretations of the evidence you each bring onto the shared stage, different experts that you trust. And through healthy, respectful discussion, you can maybe come to better understand each other's perspectives and maybe forge a shared view that is a synthesis compatible with the underlying concerns you each bring to the discussion. I suspect that many people watching this video will already be wary of the overconfident use of rational calculation by some modernists, and the rabbit hole of uncertain relativism presented by some postmodernists. But there are some argument tropes that seem to suggest that if you reject one end of this spectrum, then you pretty much have to accept the other. Portfolism tries to help us get away from this kind of false dichotomy by providing some ideas and language and metaphors to build a solid philosophical foundation for a stable synthesis of the best ideas from both ends of this spectrum. In this sense, Portfolism is a sort of meta-dialect of reason for those who agree that we will always have to strive for a healthy balance between our use of rational calculation and our judgment. And I hope the ideas of Portfolism will help more people to confidently inhabit this kind of sensible middle ground on which it will be easier to build a culture of healthy public discussion. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, then please do share it on social media or click on the like button below or subscribe to my channel, as all of these will encourage YouTube to share this video with more people. And I'm very interested to hear any comments you may have about the ideas of Portfolism, so please do leave comments below. Thank you for watching.